This morning, we're going to be beginning a series that'll take us through the summer and then transition into the fall. When we were know that we were going to be finishing up Romans this year and looking ahead, decided that it would be maybe a prudent thing and a necessary thing for us to consider the idea of wisdom. Certainly, if for living in the times which we live, and certainly true of any time, but we talk about the need for wisdom, living wisely. And so we determined that we would work through as the subject of wisdom over the course of the summer, and then transition into the book of James in the fall for an exposition of the book of James. The book of James is a book of wisdom too. Normally when you think of Bible and you think of wisdom, you think of the book of Proverbs, but James is a New Testament equivalent of the book of Proverbs. And so we'll transition into the book of James in the fall. But over the course of the summer, we want to talk a little bit about wisdom. Wisdom is something that it doesn't matter who you talk to. Everyone will say, I want to be a wise person. I desire wisdom. It doesn't matter whether they're a believer or an unbeliever. And in actuality, probably today, the wisdom approach is probably much more effective even in terms of sharing the gospel. Some of us grew up in an age where it was far more propositional, that you shared 4 spiritual laws. This is true, this is true, this is true, this is true. Well, that isn't the most effective means in terms of sharing the gospel anymore. We don't live in an age where propositions are so readily accepted. But if you use a wisdom approach and talk about wisdom, and everyone has an interest in wisdom, nobody says, I want to be a fool. Then the questions are, well, where do you get wisdom from? What is wisdom? You can start to ask questions about the basis of wisdom and then move to the wisdom of God. And so we're going to be looking at living wisely in an age of folly, and we'll talk this morning to distinguish the idea of the age of folly and the wisdom of God. Certainly, if you start to talk to people about wisdom and the sources of wisdom, they will appeal to a variety of sources. And there are religious writings, much like what we're doing. Our religious writing would be the Bible. Well, we come to the Bible as our source of wisdom. If you're Jewish, you wouldn't necessarily appeal to the New Testament, but certainly the Old Testament, the Scriptures, would be a source of wisdom for you. If you are from an Islamic, Muslim community, you're not going to be necessarily appealing to the Bible. Your source of wisdom would be the Quran. And then if you are from a Hindu community, then your source of wisdom would be the Vedas or the Hindu scriptures. And if you go a little further to the east, they may appeal even to the writings of Confucius. And I think we're familiar with things like Confucius say, those wise sayings of a supposed wise man. And so, if not from religious writings, sometimes they're from cultural and experiential traditions. Aesop's fables. We don't know a whole lot about Aesop, but what we can gather and put together, he probably was a slave who procured his freedom by being clever. He lived around 500 BC, somewhere in that ballpark. And his fables, his stories, are stories of wisdom. They use animals or other objects to teach a moral lesson, some kind of moral choice and how you might want to live a moral life, or what constitutes morality. Some, it's proverbial maxims. A maxim would be just a principle or a rule, and some of those are just proverbial sayings. We have them in our culture, things like a stitch in time saves 9, or look before you leap. Those are words of wisdom, maxims of wisdom. And for others, it's life lessons. When I use the term life lessons, it's that which comes out of our experience or the experience of others. As we go through life, there are lessons that we learn that we pass on. We often do that as parents. We share our experiences with our children so that hopefully they don't make the same mistakes that we do. That's life lessons passing on. For our purposes, certainly we're making an assumption. We're making a presupposition, as would be very obvious in our setting, that the Bible provides for us the authority of wisdom. And that will raise a question that we will have to address over the course of the next few weeks, and that is, why the Bible? Why the Bible? Why not the Quran? What makes the wisdom of the Bible more authoritative than any other source? And so let me just give you a heads up on some things that some of our looks over the next week and even this morning may be a little more cerebral than practical, okay? But the cerebral are really necessary. How we think, how we lay a foundation for hopefully what makes a difference in how you live practically is rooted in what our understanding of wisdom is and how that plays out in our thinking and our thought processes, so that when we act, when we do look to be wise, it's rooted and grounded in an authority of wisdom. And so for our purposes this morning, though, we're going to begin with that assumption. So if you're looking at wisdom, and certainly you would look at the book of Proverbs, right? Book of Proverbs would be a good place to begin. And so if you have a Bible, turn to Proverbs chapter 1. Read from there, or if you want to read from the screen. But Proverbs chapter 1, certainly Solomon, who's qualified as a wise man, is writing words of instruction, words of wisdom to be passed on from generation to generation. Solomon is not the only author in the book of Proverbs. There are others who share wisdom in this collection of Proverbs. But let's pick up at verse 2 of chapter 1. Solomon, who's writing this in the prologue, says, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity. I want you to stop there for a minute, because those are three words that we are hearing every day in our culture right now. Righteousness, justice, and equity. But the problem is, even early on, you're going to say, well, wait a minute. How do we know what's righteous? How do we know what's just? How do we know what equity is? What's the source that provides wisdom for defining them? Well, it's going to be obvious as we read through this that it's God. And so, unfortunately, as we hear these words, these mantras of our time, they're often stated either in a vacuum or in ways that would contradict the very truths of wisdom. So hopefully we'll learn about righteousness, justice, and equity as we consider what wisdom is. To receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And then into chapter 2 and verses 5 and 6. Then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. And then probably one of the more familiar passages out of Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so our appeal is to the Word of God, that which God has revealed concerning himself, God has revealed concerning what wisdom is, and he is the source of wisdom. So let's define it. Let's define what wisdom is. Biblical wisdom is not merely about decision making. Often when people use the term wisdom, they say, well, pray for me, I need wisdom. What they mean is I've got a major decision I need to make, and so I need wisdom for guidance from God to know how to make that decision. Wisdom biblically doesn't necessarily just mean decision making. Wisdom and its companion word, understanding, or sometimes the translations use the word insight, carry the thought of knowledge in the realm of the unknown or unseen, as well as that which is known or seen. So let me explain what I mean by its companion word first off. In Hebrew poetry, and wisdom literature like this is considered Hebrew poetry, one of the devices that is used for constructing that poetry is something called parallelism. So when you think of poetry, don't think of roses are red, violets are blue. Okay, it's not necessarily poetry like that. Their poetry may not necessarily always have meter. Okay, but one of their devices is called parallelism. And so through their wisdom literature, you will find a statement. And then on the heels of that, the next line is another statement that many times is the same thing, it's just restated in different words. It's a synonymous statement repeating what has been said in the previous line, but maybe with different words. Sometimes that parallel statement is antithetical. So stated positively, and then in a negative or an opposite statement in the next line. And so when I use the term companion word, you see it here, for example, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding. There you see wisdom and understanding. If you turn over to chapter 2 and verse 6, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. You see knowledge and understanding in these parallels, in these companion statements. The realm of the seen and the unseen. Wisdom, biblically, in the ancient Near East was not just seeing or observing what you can see. Wisdom involved a knowledge, involved insights into that which you could not see. It involved insights into the unknown. So let me give you an example. Daniel, and you find in the book of Daniel, is called a wise man. He's a part of the court there in Babylon, the court of wise men. They don't just give the king advice. The idea of being a wise man is that they would come and they would be able to speak into the life of the king those things that weren't necessarily the obvious, but had a sense of into the unseen realm. So for Daniel, for example, the interpretation of dreams. What you find is Daniel, his wisdom is that he understands and interprets dreams. He speaks out of the unseen realm and to be able to speak into the life of the king. Joseph would be a wise man too. A wise man in the sense that he interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh. And so he now becomes this key person in Pharaoh's court, not only for what he sees and being able to make assessments based on that, but his knowledge of what appears to be the unseen. And so our definition of wisdom must take into account that which is seen and unseen. And so, explain a little further, it means insights into the supernatural as well as the natural. Both realms, I may summarize as the reality. Biblical reality is a worldview that sees both the natural and the supernatural world and the relationship between the two in order to understand and then live in the world as it actually is. From a biblical point of view, you must understand that reality is not just the seen. It also involves the unseen. On my way in this morning, I was listening to a hymn. It was Martin Luther's hymn. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. As Luther works through that great hymn, he says, and though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us. What is he saying? There's an unseen world that constitutes reality as well. Too often we're so focused on the natural, we forget the supernatural. We forget the unseen. If you're going to understand reality, you both must come into view. If you're going to be wise, you must understand both the seen and the unseen reality. And there's the relationship between the two, and then how do we live in the world as it actually is. Gregory Kukul, in his book, The Story of Reality, says that every religion and every secular philosophy claims to represent reality in a true and accurate way. Indeed, every person has a view like this of some sort. Everyone has his or her in his or her mind a story about the way the world actually is, even if they haven't thought about it or haven't worked out all the details. That's why I said it's a great apologetics. It's a great way to present the gospel, because everybody has their view of reality. They may not have figured out why or how. By the way, Kukul's work, The Story of Reality, is worth the read. It's not a very thick book. It's something you can work through, but I encourage you, if you enjoy reading along that level, to pick that up. But his point is, look, everybody has a something by which they're trying to establish reality. The Bible presents us a reality, and it includes both the seen and the unseen. And wisdom sees the relationship between the two, understands the reality of the two and its relationship, and then how we live. So as we define wisdom, our working definition, at least initially and probably through the summer, is this: wisdom is living life in correspondence to reality and in distinction to alternative realities, which are identified as folly. And I use the term folly coming out of the book of Proverbs and other wisdom literature. There you see the word folly or foolishness. Okay? And so folly ignores or denies, or to use the word of our time, deconstructs reality. Folly either ignores, denies, or deconstructs reality and then constructs an alternative reality in order to alleviate guilt, pursue natural cravings or actions that ultimately result in calamity, empty fulfillment, despair, and ultimately a final accountability, or no accountability. And so folly, and we'll see this in the scripture as you work through the book of Proverbs, you see, look, the fool, the life and the result of the fool is his life ends up in a disaster. It ends up in chaos. It ends up in emptiness. And so the alternative reality, the alternative wisdom, actually leads to the foolishness as its end, folly as its end. Number of passages again out of the book of Proverbs. Chapter 1 and verse 22, how long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. You're either a fool, scoffer. The scoffer is the fool. Simple-minded, naive, because you really hate knowledge. Knowledge is that which is real. Paul picks up on the ideas, and as he addresses the Corinthian church and the people of Corinth, who are lovers of wisdom, he says, where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world. For since in the wisdom of God, the world, through its wisdom, did not come to know God. There's a wisdom of the world, there's a wisdom of God. The wisdom of the world is folly. And then James chapter 3, and we'll get there at some point. James says, this wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. And the result of that is jealousy and selfish ambition exists. There's disorder and every evil thing. Chaos. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. So you have this contrast between the wisdom, the word of God, and the foolishness or the folly of the world. Now, I'm going to use an illustration that will date me, but it will date a lot of you too. I readily admit that I've enjoyed through the music of the Beatles. Hard to believe that the Beatles were only at the peak. Their career only lasted 10 years. Essentially 10 years. Their last album was released 50 years ago in May. That'll make you feel old, won't it? Let It Be was their last album. That was released in May of 1970. One of the things about the Beatles, as you follow their music and their lyrics, you realize that the Beatles were looking for reality. They were in search of fulfillment, satisfaction, and reality, the meaning of life. And they as they worked through, they looked for it in either sexual activity, they looked for it in alcohol, they looked for it in drugs, they looked for it in transcendental meditation, Eastern religions. They looked everywhere and tried everything in their search for what we might define as wisdom. When they disbanded in 1970, McCartney, Lennon, and certainly George Harrison, Ringo Starr have continued on, at least for a while, some of them, a music legacy. John Lennon penned what has become his most famous song in 1971. So a year later, John Lennon wrote a song that continues on. The legacy of the Beatles is not just the impact on music, not just the impact they had in the music world, but the impact that they had culturally, the impact upon generations. Okay? Lennon has a legacy that remains from his writing, even to today. And so on New Year's Eve, 2019, thousands of people are gathered in Times Square. Thousands upon thousands of people in Times Square, and people all over the world watching as the ball drops. When the ball drops, they all link arms and they sing John Lennon's song from 1971. You know what it is? Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No greed, no need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. I got news for Mr. Lennon. He is a dreamer, because that's not reality. In fact, the very title tells you this isn't reality. Imagine. It's something out of his own imagination, a construction of reality that is an alternative to what God says is real. Imagine is the theme song for Folly. And yet the world links arms and says, this is what we want. So Paul McCartney continued writing music. He still has. Paul McCartney is still traveling the world doing concerts. In 1993, so another 22 years after Lennon wrote his, this is what Paul McCartney said. Remember, he's searched everywhere. His life. I'll always be hoping. I will understand someday, one day. Always from now until then. When it will be right, I don't know. What it will be like, I don't know. We live in hope of deliverance from the darkness that surrounds us. Hope of deliverance, hope of deliverance, hope of deliverance from the darkness that surrounds us. After everywhere he's looked, he says, I'm hoping and longing for deliverance from darkness. What you find is that the world either ignores, denies, deconstructs, and then constructs a reality of their own, which ultimately results in despair, no fulfillment, and chaos. So our working definition is like very simply this: wisdom is living life in correspondence to reality. Living life in correspondence to reality. Reality, seen, unseen, natural, and supernatural. And that will make a difference. That will make practical difference in life. It impacts how you make ethical choices. How do we know what is the highest good? How do we know what's right? How do we know what's wrong? And then how do we prioritize our life? I just call that values. How do you determine values? Where do values come from? How do we relate to others? And then how do we function in society? If you were to work through Proverbs, you work through the biblical wisdom literature, and you'll find that those four general areas are all addressed. And they all come out of wisdom. A wise person describes an individual who possesses moral insight and skill in deciding practical issues of conduct derived from their personal knowledge of God and His design for life in the real world. The personal knowledge of God, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And then what has God designed for life in the real world? That's a wise person. And somewhere along the line, when you're considering wisdom, you're going to be confronted by an individual. Everyone will be confronted by this individual. He's the wisest man who's ever lived. And his name is not Solomon. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. Because Jesus knew God perfectly. Jesus knew the reality of both the supernatural and the natural world. And he knew the relationship and lived a life in relationship to both perfectly. And it's Jesus who not only is the wisest man, but Jesus is the one through whom we have access to wisdom, through what he's accomplished for us. That's actually that 1 Corinthians 1 passage, where the foolishness of the cross, the foolishness of what Jesus accomplished, the foolishness of the gospel, is the wisdom of God on display in the person and the work of Jesus. And along the way, every person is going to have to answer the question, who's Jesus? Because the answer to that question will introduce you to wisdom.